The first time I saw the snow globe, I should have walked away. Something about it felt wrong. Not in a loud, screaming way, but like a whisper tugging at the back of my mind. It was subtle, almost like the sensation of déjà vu. Like I'd seen it before, though I knew I hadn't. I found it on a quiet, unremarkable evening while rummaging through an old thrift shop at the edge of town. The shop wasn't particularly inviting. Dusty shelves, flickering lights, and a faint, musty smell that seemed to seep into your skin. Yet something pulled me there that night. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe it was the snow globe itself. It sat on a shelf near the back, surrounded by broken toys and forgotten trinkets, as if the world had deliberately hidden it away. The glass dome gleamed faintly under the flickering bulb, its surface pristine despite the clutter around it. Inside, tiny flakes of glittering snow lay frozen over a miniature village. The scene was idyllic, too perfect, almost eerily so. I don't know why I picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the cool glass, a strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't quite fear, but it wasn't comfort either. It was like the room had grown quieter, heavier. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with tired eyes, appeared behind me out of nowhere. His voice startled me. "That's not for sale," he said flatly. I blinked, holding the globe closer to examine it. It was on the shelf. "Isn't everything here for sale?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. After what felt like forever, he sighed and said, "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. That should have been enough to stop me. A normal person would have put it back." But something about his words only made me more curious. Warn me? About what? The price he named was absurdly low, barely worth the trouble of arguing. I handed over the cash, ignoring the uneasy feeling gnawing at the edges of my mind. As I left the shop, I could feel his eyes on my back, watching me until I disappeared into the night. The snow globe wasn't like anything I'd owned before. It didn't feel like a simple decoration. Even as I placed it on the old bookshelf in my living room, it seemed to draw the air around it, like it had a gravity of its own. I sat there for a while, just staring at it. When the light hit the glass just right, the snowflakes inside shimmered like stars, casting faint patterns on the wall. The miniature village was unervingly detailed. Tiny houses with frosted rooftops, a cobblestone path winding through the town square, and even little figures frozen mid-movement. One of them caught my eye, a figure standing apart from the others, positioned right in the center of the square. It was small, indistinct, but there was something unsettling about the way it was turned, as if it was looking out at me. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the snow globe was somehow alive. I told myself it was ridiculous. It was just glass and water, right? Nothing more. But when I closed my eyes, the image of the little village kept flashing in my mind, as if it was calling me back. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it wasn't peaceful. I dreamed of snow endless, falling snow. In the dream, I was standing in the middle of the same village, surrounded by silence. No wind, no footsteps, no voices, just the sound of snowflakes landing softly on the ground. And then, just as I turned to leave, I saw it, a shadow, faint and far away, moving between the houses. It wasn't clear what it was, human, animal, couldn't tell, but it was watching me. I could feel it. I woke up with a start, my heart racing. The room was dark and silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, the snow globe looked harmless again. Beautiful, even. It was so easy to dismiss the strange dreams and unsettling feelings as just my imagination. But deep down, I knew. I couldn't explain how or why, but I knew that my life had shifted the moment I touched that snow globe. Something had begun, and whatever it wasn't going to stop. The first sign that something wasn't normal about the snow globe came 2 days later. By then, I had mostly dismissed the weird feelings it had given me. I mean, I wasn't entirely comfortable with it sitting on my shelf, but I figured I was just overthinking. It's funny how we convince ourselves that everything is fine when we don't want to deal with the alternative. That evening, I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. The snow globe, it wasn't where I had left it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I remembered placing it on the middle shelf, right next to a stack of old books. But now it was sitting on the edge, teetering like it might fall. Did I move it? I muttered to myself, getting up to put it back. Maybe I'd bumped the shelf earlier and didn't notice. It was the logical explanation, right? But when I picked it up, the air around me seemed to shift. For a moment, the room felt colder, and a shiver ran down my spine. I turned the globe over in my hands, staring at the tiny village inside. Everything looked the same. Almost. The figure in the town square, it had moved. I swear it wasn't like that before. It was standing closer to the houses now, almost tucked into the shadows of the buildings. I stared at it, trying to convince myself that I was wrong. It was just a trick of the light or my memory playing games with me. Then I noticed something even stranger. A slip of paper tucked under the base of the globe. It hadn't been there before, and I couldn't imagine how I'd missed it. Slowly, I unfolded it, my fingers trembling slightly. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting was messy, as if the writer had been in a hurry. Rules. That's all it said at the top, underlined twice. Beneath it was a list, each rule written in the same shaky handwriting. Do not shake the globe after sunset. Never touch the glass with wet hands. If the figure in the town square is missing, leave the house immediately. I read them over and over, my heart pounding harder with each pass. Who wrote this? And why would anyone make rules for a snow globe? It made no sense. But the third rule, something about it made my stomach turn. I looked back at the globe. The figure was still there, standing in the shadows of the tiny buildings. It hadn't moved again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't as harmless as it seemed. That night, I barely slept. The paper with the rules sat on my nightstand, and the snow globe, I couldn't bring myself to move it. It stayed on the shelf exactly where I'd left it, though I kept glancing at it, half expecting it to do something. The dreams came back, too. This time they were clearer, sharper. I was back in the village, but now it wasn't silent. I could hear faint whispers, too soft to understand, but they were everywhere, carried on the still air. And the figure, it was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped out of the shadows, its tiny body barely visible against the falling snow. It didn't have a face, not really, but somehow I knew it was looking at me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing like I'd just run a marathon. For a moment, I just sat there, staring into the darkness of my room, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I decided to test the rules. Not because I wanted to break them, no, I wasn't that reckless. But I needed to know if they meant anything. Were they just some kind of prank left by the shopkeeper? Or was there something more to them? Rule 1 seemed like the safest place to start. Do not shake the globe after sunset. It was still daylight, so I picked it up and shook it gently. The snowflakes inside swirled to life, creating a soft, mesmerizing blizzard over the tiny village. For a moment, it was beautiful, almost hypnotic. But then something changed. The snow didn't settle like it normally would. Instead, it kept swirling, faster and faster, until it looked like a full-blown storm trapped inside the glass. The houses began to disappear under the snow, and the figure in the square. It turned. It was looking straight at me. I dropped the globe, my hands shaking. It didn't break. Somehow the glass was stronger than it looked. But the storm inside didn't stop. The snow kept falling, and the figure kept staring, even as I shoved the globe back onto the shelf and backed away. I didn't touch it again for the rest of the day. That night, I made sure to follow the rules. I didn't shake the globe, and I avoided touching the glass altogether. But I couldn't stop myself from checking on it, just to make sure the figure was still there. When I peeked at it before bed, everything seemed normal. The storm had settled, the snowflakes resting peacefully over the village. And the figure, it hadn't moved. It was back in the square, standing as still as ever. I felt a small wave of relief as I turned off the light. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe the globe was just a weird old toy, and the rules were someone's idea of a twisted joke. But at 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the silence of the house. A soft tapping, like someone gently knocking on glass. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the living room, from the shelf, from the snow globe. The tapping sound felt like it was drilling into my skull, each knock louder than the last. My hands shook as I crept out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. The house was silent except for that rhythmic tapping, steady and deliberate, coming from the direction of the living room. I hesitated at the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing. A loose pipe, maybe, or even a stray breeze rattling a window. But deep down, I knew better. When I stepped into the living room, the snow globe was the first thing I saw. It sat exactly where I'd left it, perched on the middle shelf, bathed in the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the window. But something was wrong. The tiny figure in the village square, it wasn't there anymore. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted across the miniature scene, searching for the figure, but it was gone. The cobblestone square where it always stood was empty, eerily lifeless. The tapping had stopped, and then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I spun around, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind me. But the room was empty, as silent and still as it had been when I first entered. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried, the unease wouldn't go away. I turned back to the snow globe, my pulse racing as I picked it up. As I tilted it, the snowflakes began to swirl, revealing something I hadn't noticed before. There was a tiny, shadowy figure now standing at the edge of the village, just beyond the last house. It wasn't like the others, it didn't look like it belonged there. Its form was blurry, undefined, but there was something undeniably menacing about it. The way it stood, facing the houses as though watching them, made my skin crawl. The rules flashed through my mind, clear and sharp. If the figure in the town square is missing, leave the house immediately. But where could I go in the middle of the night and leave my own home because of a snow globe? It sounded ridiculous, even as every instinct in my body screamed at me to listen. Instead of running, I did something I'd regret later. I placed the globe back on the shelf and grabbed a blanket, curling up on the couch. Maybe if I stayed close to it, I thought I'd feel safer. I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to pretend everything was normal. I went about my routine, making coffee, answering emails, but the snow globe stayed on my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the missing figure or the shadowy new presence inside the dome. And then things started happening. Little things at first almost easy to dismiss. The lights in the hallway flickered every time I passed. Not just a single bulb, but the entire strip. On, off, off. At first, I thought it was an electrical issue, but the timing was too perfect, almost as though the lights were reacting to me. Then my phone started acting up. Random static interrupted my calls, and my messages wouldn't send. Once, while scrolling through my photos, I found an image I hadn't taken. A blurry shot of my living room at night. But the worst part? In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was the faint outline of a figure standing by the bookshelf. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening. But the snow globe wouldn't let me. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat across the room from the shelf, staring at the globe like it was an animal that might pounce at any moment. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. It was like the atmosphere had changed, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. I picked up the rules again, rereading them for what felt like the 100th time. Do not shake the globe after sunset. It was sunset now, the orange light fading into darkness. My hands tightened around the paper. Never touch the glass with wet hands. That one seemed easy enough to follow. But the third rule, it haunted me. If the figure in the town square is missing, leave the house immediately. The figure was still gone. The shadow at the edge of the village hadn't moved, at least not while I was watching. But the longer I stared at it, the more I felt like it could move at any moment. It wasn't long before I heard the noises again. This time it wasn't tapping. It was footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps echoed through the house, though I couldn't tell where they were coming from. They weren't loud, more like the sound of someone pacing slowly on carpet. I stood frozen, clutching the blanket draped over my shoulders. My heart raced, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But I didn't know where to go. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It stretched on, thick and suffocating, until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, fumbling with the flashlight, and aimed it toward the bookshelf. The snow globe was still there, untouched. But now the shadowy figure inside was gone too. I didn't know what to do. The rules had warned me, but I'd stayed anyway, clinging to the hope that this was all just some strange coincidence. Now, though I wasn't so sure, I decided to test the rules again. Maybe that was stupid, but I needed answers. I picked up the globe, careful not to shake it, and tilted it toward the light. Nothing happened at first. The snowflakes shifted lazily, reflecting the beam from my phone. The village looked as peaceful as ever, almost like a postcard. Then, out of nowhere, a crack appeared on the glass. It wasn't big, just a thin, jagged line running across the surface. But it wasn't there before, and the second I saw it, the lights in the room flickered violently, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the globe. My phone's flashlight flickered weakly, its beam cutting through the darkness in erratic bursts. I heard the footsteps again, louder this time, as though they were right behind me. I spun around, shining the light wildly, but there was nothing there. Then I heard it, a voice, faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, but unmistakably real. Why didn't you leave? The voice was faint but clear enough to freeze me where I stood. Why didn't you leave? It came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My body tensed, every hair standing on end, as if the air itself had come alive. I spun around, the flashlight on my phone trembling in my grip, but all it revealed were shadows dancing along the walls. The snow globe sat on the shelf, ominously quiet. The crack on its surface was faint, but somehow it seemed to pulse, like it was alive. I'm losing my mind, I whispered, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real. But the words sounded hollow even to me. That's when the footsteps started again. They were louder this time, closer, moving through the house with a deliberate rhythm. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. No answer. Then came a sound that made my stomach drop. A faint, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I stumbled into the kitchen, slamming the door behind me. My hands fumbled for the lock, my breaths coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear anything, but the house was completely still. Just as I started to think it was over, the kitchen lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist across the walls. The silence was broken by a new sound, something scratching against the door. My body froze. It wasn't like nails on wood. It was softer, more deliberate, like someone tracing their fingers along the surface. Then, a voice, soft, barely a whisper, spoke from the other side. "Why didn't you leave?" My heart stopped. I staggered back, knocking over a chair in my panic. The scraping on the door stopped, replaced by the faint sound of breathing. Slow, steady, and impossibly close. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there waiting for whatever was on the other side to come in. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. My gaze landed on the snow globe's rules, crumpled on the counter where I'd left them. If the figure in the town square is missing, leave the house immediately. The figure was gone, and I hadn't left. I'd ignored the one warning that could have kept me safe. Then it hit me. The rules weren't just there to follow, they were there to protect me. And I'd broken them. I had to leave. Now, grabbing my phone and keys, I bolted for the back door. But as soon as I reached it, I stopped dead in my tracks. The figure was standing there. It wasn't small and shadowy anymore. It was full-sized, towering over me, its form dark and featureless. There were no eyes, no face, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, like heat rising off pavement. I turned and ran for the front door, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. But as I reached the living room, I froze again. The snow globe, it was glowing. The faint light inside was growing brighter, illuminating the tiny village in a way that made it look almost alive. I hesitated, torn between running for the door and grabbing the globe. I didn't understand why, but something told me I needed it, that it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I grabbed the globe and bolted for the front door. My hand barely touched the doorknob before I felt it. A cold, heavy pressure on my shoulder. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was right behind me, its faceless head tilted slightly, as if studying me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, as though the house itself was closing in. Then the figure raised a hand and pointed at the snow globe in my grasp. I didn't understand what it wanted. Was it trying to take the globe? Was that why it had come? A voice, louder this time, filled the room. "You broke the rules. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but in that moment, I shook the snow globe as hard as I could. The snowflakes inside erupted into a blizzard, swirling violently around the tiny village. The glow intensified, spilling out into the room, and the figure recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. But the light wasn't just affecting the figure. It was affecting the house, too. The walls seemed to warp and shift, the floor beneath my feet trembling as though the entire building was being pulled into the globe. The figure lunged at me, its movements jerky and unnatural, but I was faster. I hurled the globe across the room, and it shattered against the wall, the sound echoing like a gunshot. For a moment, everything stopped. The figure froze mid-lunge, its body flickering and distorting. Then, with a deafening roar, it was pulled backward, collapsing in on itself as it disappeared into the shattered remains of the globe. The house fell silent. The air was still. The oppressive weight that had been suffocating me was gone. But the relief didn't last long. I turned to look at the remains of the snow globe scattered across the floor. Among the shards of glass and glittering snowflakes was something new. A faint, glowing crack in the air itself, like a window into somewhere else. And from that crack came a sound. Footsteps. I stumbled out of the hospital, the first rays of sunlight slanting across the parking lot like bars on a cage. My chest heaved with every breath, my legs barely holding me up as I clutched the snow globe against my side. The cold air hit my face, but it wasn't enough to shake the sticky heat of fear crawling up my spine. I should have felt relief. I was alive. I was out. But the weight in my hand told me otherwise. The snow globe was still here. Somehow, I didn't remember grabbing it. I didn't even want it. But now it was mine, as if it had decided I belonged to it. I didn't stop walking until I was far from the hospital, not trusting myself to look back. Every step felt heavier, as if the invisible hands I'd felt in that cursed building were still reaching for me, clawing at the edges of my mind. When I finally sat on the curb, the world spun. My head fell into my hands, but the images didn't stop. The flickering lights, the sound of whispers, the shadow that had been behind me when I broke the rules. I should have smashed the snow globe. I should have hurled it into the street and let the weight of a truck crush it into nothing. But I didn't. Somehow I knew it wouldn't work. That it wasn't the snow globe itself, but what it represented. A doorway, a trap, and now, a tether. The faint sound of snow swirling inside it made me jerk upright. It wasn't loud, barely a whisper, but it was there. My hands started to shake again, and I stared down at it, half expecting to see something staring back at me from within the swirling storm. It was empty, or at least it looked empty. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the snow was falling in slow motion, like it was waiting for something. For me. I shoved it into my pocket and stumbled to my feet. The hospital was just a speck in the distance now, but it didn't feel far enough away. Nothing ever would. Days passed, maybe a week. Time stopped making sense after that night. I kept it together long enough to get home, lock the doors, and cover the windows. I told myself it was just my nerves, that anyone would be paranoid after what I'd been through. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every shadow in the corner of my vision felt alive, moving just enough to make me doubt my sanity. I couldn't sleep, not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there, hiding under the desk, holding my breath as something scratched at the walls. The snow globe stayed on the table. I didn't dare move it. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a stupid trinket. But the longer it sat there, the more I felt it watching me. And sometimes, when I wasn't looking directly at it, I thought I saw shapes moving inside. Not snow, not wind, something else. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked it up, intending to throw it out the window, to hurl it as far away from me as possible. But the moment my fingers touched the glass, a chill ran through me so deep it felt like my bones were freezing. I swear I heard a faint voice. Not words, but a feeling, a command. Don't let go. I couldn't. My hands locked around it, and for one terrifying second, I saw the hospital again. The hallways stretched into infinity. The lights flickered in time with my heartbeat, and the shadows moved closer, circling. Then it was gone. I was back in my apartment, my reflection staring back at me from the glass, pale and hollow-eyed. But now I knew. The snow globe wasn't just a memory of what happened. It was a part of it, a piece of that place still connected to me. And I didn't escape. Not really. I haven't gone outside since. Not because I think it's safer in here. It's not. But because I'm afraid of what might follow me if I leave. The snow globe stays on the table, and I stay in my chair, watching it, listening. The snow falls slower now, and sometimes I think I see faces in the storm. Familiar faces. The people who didn't make it out. Last night, I heard a knock at the door. 3 soft taps, just like the ones I heard in the ICU. I didn't answer. I'm not sure what I would have done if I had. Sometimes I wonder if I should go back. If it would be better to face it again, to find out what's inside the storm, rather than sit here and wait for it to come to me. But deep down, I already know. I'll never really leave. Not as long as I have this. Not as long as it has me. And the snow globe, it's mine now, but maybe it's always been. Subscribe for more horror stories every day.